It's a program like no other in the state. Minnesota high school juniors have the opportunity to not just see how state government works, but to be part of the legislative action.
It's really interesting to actually be a part of a committee and see how it worked.
It seems like the program is getting better and better too, getting exposed to more things.
Join us on Monday, July 29th as we begin our 6-part series on the Minnesota House High School Page Program. You'll see the incredible access pages received to the legislature and learn how the program is making a positive impact on Minnesota students across the state.
The significance of this problem continues to grow, and it continues to have an effect on communities in our state, including Duluth.
Synthetic marijuana contains dried, shredded plant material and chemical additives. It is sold under many names and packaged often with a warning label that says, "Not for human consumption." Representative Erik Simonson, who is an assistant fire chief in his hometown of Duluth, is on the front lines of the growing problem.
When you look at the synthetic drug problem across the state, Duluth has probably got the largest, or at the very least the most visible.
According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, synthetic marijuana can cause extreme anxiety, racing heartbeat, vomiting, and hallucinations. House Speaker Paul Thiessen chose Simonson to chair the House Select Committee on Controlled Substances and Synthetic Drugs.
I've got a vested interest in this, and I followed it for a number of years here in Duluth, so I think it was a natural pick, although maybe a little unusual for a freshman, but at the same time, in terms of the subject matter, I think it's a good fit.
Minnesota's synthetic drug law bans the use and sale of substances found in designer drugs. But drug makers change formulas and add new ones to the market, claiming they are illegal. The committee's goals include working to change current law to make it more effective and to present a report of the scope of the problem in Minnesota to the legislature.
Our public health systems are being overwhelmed, and we now know that it's growing in greater Minnesota as well. Maybe not to the same degree yet, but left unchecked, it certainly will continue.
Representative Kathy Lohmer, a member of the Select Committee, says she's ready to get to work.
I did contact the Washington County Sheriff's Department and asked them, and they said that there is a problem, and there are these drugs being sold in shops in Stillwater and in the district. So I was surprised to learn that, but another reason why I really want to be involved. And I would really like to make a difference in this way because this is a very serious problem for young people in our state.
According to a study funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, in 2011, 11% of U.S. high school seniors reported using synthetic marijuana in the past year. That's why, along with the committee's other goals, they want to create an education program.
We want to try to put together a concept for a educational program that could be targeted towards middle school, high school, potentially college-age students as to the impact of synthetic drugs.
Representative Simonson says they are planning a meeting in Brainerd where he says increasingly they are seeing the problem of more people using synthetic marijuana. Let's now go live to today's meeting at the Capitol.
tonight's Select Committee on Controlled Substances and Synthetic Drugs is called to order. I want to welcome everybody to a lovely July day here in St. Paul. Today we've got a full agenda, which you should have in your folder. And again, for the sake of the public and the media, this is probably, I think, our first official committee meeting. We kind of had an unofficial tag-along up in Duluth with the Attorney General when she held a hearing to hear about the impact on my community, impact from synthetic drugs and what's happening with that in Duluth. And I want to thank the representatives and staff that took the time to come up there and be a part of that. And for those that didn't, we should have a transcript coming soon from the AG's office, so at least you'll be able to get the information. It was a long day, a lot of testimony, a lot of passion, obviously, around the issues. So as we move forward, at the end of today, we'll kind of talk about the roadmap over the interim. But for today's purposes is really just kind of set the groundwork. We're going to hear some historical perspective as well as some things that are going on currently from different state agencies and other folks that have been involved dealing with these issues over the last number of years. And I think as we go through our testifiers, if we could just hold our questions until they're done and then go through questions, and then if they need to leave, they certainly can leave. So with that, and we'll have discussion at the end of the meeting today. We will be breaking for lunch probably around noon at whatever time the BCA wraps up their testimony. We'll take a break for about an hour and come back. We'll hope to get out of here by 3:30 today, if things go as planned. So with that, let's start with Mr. Diebel, House Research, talk a little bit about the history from the House perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Chair Simonson asked that I provide a brief overview of some of the legislative initiatives targeting synthetic drugs. I'd like to point you to two act summaries that are in your packets. Those are from the two most recent legislative initiatives targeting synthetic drugs from 2011 and 2012. As I go through my material, feel free to ask questions. This touches on a lot of base knowledge of Chapter 152 and controlled substances, so if you have questions about that or any of the legislation, feel free to interrupt me. I'd like to start my presentation with an overview of the 2005 meth law, which I think is the original synthetic drug legislation. That took place in 2005, and some of the key provisions of that law that some of you may be familiar with include restrictions on the sale of pseudoephedrine. The legislation put limits on the amount that individuals could buy at one time, as well as the amount that they could purchase within a month. Some of the provisions they used to implement this were to require photo ID at the time of purchase, as well as log books at the pharmacy. As well, pseudoephedrine had to be put behind the counter and dispensed by only pharmacists and pharmacy staff. The law in 2005 also increased penalties for the manufacture of methamphetamine and the possession of certain substances used in the manufacture of methamphetamine. The effect of the 2005 law was that it greatly reduced the number of methamphetamine labs in the state. It reduced the number of meth offenses, and it's my understanding that it required the Department of Corrections to lower their estimates about the growth in the prison population that was trending rapidly up from the late 90s through the first part of this century. Now I'd like to skip forward to 2011, and the Act summary for Chapter 53, as I mentioned, is in your packet. The legislation in 2011 arose out of the increasing use of synthetic cannabinoids and synthetic cathinones, also known as bath salts. In 2011, the legislature added these substances to Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substance Schedules. Schedule 1 substances, for those who aren't familiar with how the schedules are organized, require that the substance have a high potential for abuse, that has no currently accepted medical use, and there's a lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision. So this synthetic cannabinoids and synthetic cathinones or bath salts were added to Schedule 1. The effect of this is to put them in a sentencing structure that, if a fourth-degree drug offense, which carries up to a 15-year felony. The legislature did, at that time, recognize that treating synthetic marijuana differently than than regular marijuana might not seem fair to some. And so they actually carved out exceptions for the penalties for synthetic cannabinoids. And under the law in 2011, if you weren't subject to the 15-year felony under fourth-degree controlled substance offense, you were actually subject to a gross misdemeanor if you sold a synthetic cannabinoid. And if you possessed a synthetic cannabinoid, you were subject to a misdemeanor penalty. It's my understanding the legislative intent was that to really scare those that were selling the substances because they were, or using the substances because they were being sold in storefronts as if they were safe and presumably legal. And so the idea was to add a minor criminal penalty so as to discourage those who would otherwise be law-abiding citizens from selling or using the substance. And based on anecdotal evidence, it seems that some storefronts did stop selling it, but many didn't. The other key provision of the 2011 legislation was that the legislature added the term analog to the controlled substance definitions. The idea was to give the schedules flexibility and give prosecutors flexibility in charging controlled substance offenses. By adding the term analog, a substance that was substantially similar in composition and effect would be treated the same as the listed substance in the schedule, thereby allowing prosecutors to take a substance that is a slight derivation of a listed substance and prosecute someone for a controlled substance offense. The goal of this was to avoid always being behind the evolving area of synthetic drugs by accounting for slight variations in the substances. And it was patterned after the federal analog statute, which has been actually on the books for quite some time. So in 2011, the legislature had passed what they thought was comprehensive synthetic drug legislation. But by 2012, it appeared that the legislation did not have the desired intent as to discouraging those from selling and using the substances. So the legislature revisited the issue just last year, and some of the key provisions of what is listed as Chapter 244 in the Act Summary include creating a felony penalty for those who sell synthetic cannabinoids, as opposed to the 2011 version, which was a gross misdemeanor. The legislature did bifurcate the sale penalty. It imposed a penalty on those that were selling it for remuneration or compensation, but it didn't. It left the penalty as a gross misdemeanor for those who were to give the substance to a friend. And that's somewhat of an anomaly in the Chapter 152. The term sell is not defined in the way that many of us use the term. It actually includes giving the substance away. So if you give a controlled substance away, it's actually considered a sale of the substance. But under this statute, if you sell a synthetic cannabinoid for compensation, you are subject to a felony penalty. If you give it away, which is technically a sale under Chapter 152, you'd only be subject to a gross misdemeanor. Another key provision of the 2012 legislative initiative on synthetic drugs was that it brought the controlled substance schedules that are maintained in statute into conformity with the controlled substance schedules that are maintained by the Board of Pharmacy. Back in the 70s, late 70s, when this structure was established in Chapter 152 for controlled substance schedules listing substances, the legislature granted the Board of Pharmacy the authority to maintain their own set of controlled substance schedules and rules, presumably to give them the flexibility to add substances to the schedules and account for changes in federal law. But the legislature also directed the Board of Pharmacy to inform the legislature when it added a substance to their schedule so that the legislature could update the statutory schedules. This had not been taking place for many years, and so there was a gap between the two schedules. There were more substances listed in the rules than there were in the statutes, and this caused some confusion among prosecutors as to what substances could be charged. So with the help of the Board of Pharmacy in 2012, the legislature corrected this problem and brought the two sets of schedules into conformity. Another key provision of the 2012 legislation was that it granted the Board of Pharmacy expedited rulemaking with the authority to add a substance to the controlled substance schedules under a shorter time period than standard rulemaking procedures required. One safeguard the legislature imposed on the board and this authority was that the legislature needs to ratify any substance that is added to the rules based on expedited rulemaking in the next legislative session. Practically speaking, if the legislature didn't ratify the decision, the board presumably could then go use standard rulemaking procedure and add the substance. But I'm not aware of the legislature taking exception to the board's decisions in the past, so likely that it would be ratified by the legislature. And I believe Mr. Weiberg from the Board of Pharmacy is going to speak next, and he can address how often they've used this and the success they've been able to, and if they've been able to successfully use this authority granted to them. There's one final provision in 2012 that was in the legislation that allowed for those that possess synthetic cannabinoids for the first time be granted the opportunity for a deferred prosecution. And this is a provision that brought the law for marijuana into conformance with synthetic cannabinoids. So if you were to possess a small amount of marijuana as your first offense, you would have the opportunity for a deferred prosecution and avoid having a criminal penalty. And so those are treated the same now under the law enacted in 2012. So, Mr. Chair, that's a brief summary of the synthetic drug legislation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that members have.
Good, thank you. Questions, members? That I'm sure that there'll be more questions that pop up later, but you're not going anywhere, so that's good. So, folks, if you look at your agenda, we next have, I believe, Mr. Cody Weiberg from the Minnesota Board of Pharmacy. Welcome, Mr. Weiberg. When you're ready.
So, we have a PowerPoint here, but I'm not quite sure how to get it working. Good morning. My name is Dr. Cody Weiberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Board of Pharmacy. And just here to talk to you today a little bit about the history of what's been going on. Actually, I was asked to answer 3 questions. Basically, what is the issue? What's been done, and what are the current problems. And then in addition to that, I've added a 4th thing, what further actions can be taken. So the issue put simply, is the use of drugs that are synthesized from raw chemicals by individuals who often have little or no formal training and who do not use appropriate manufacturing techniques. So they're literally synthesizing drugs. That's why these are called synthetic drugs. They're also called designer drugs, and I'll go into the reason that was developed in a minute here. This is not a new problem. So the definition, I found an actual definition of that term synthetic drugs in the Urban Dictionary. And basically, the definition they use is a pretty good one. It's non-organic, chemically synthesized, unsafe recreational drugs that often yield unreliable results, cause seizures and comas, reduce or remove inhibitions from the user, and come in forms that make it difficult for the user to determine if the drug is pure or tainted, which further increases the risk. Using the drugs have mild to serious hallucinogenic and psychotic nervous system effects, heavy health risks, and are extremely easy to overdose. Now, actually, this probably understates the problem. I was at the hearing that the Attorney General had up in Duluth, listened to the testimony, as I think the committee members did, from emergency room physicians. And the stories that they told were quite graphic and horrible about the effects of these drugs. And I'll talk a little bit more when I talk about the three main categories of drugs, what some of those effects are. Now, these are also sometimes called designer drugs. And that term was actually first used in the mid-1980s. And it was used to describe the situation that was happening in Los Angeles. There were a couple of attorneys out there who thought they were good attorneys. They turned out maybe not to be good attorneys, but they sure weren't good chemists. Because what they actually set out to do in the basement of their law office was to synthesize drugs that were not listed in either the state or federal drug schedules, specifically because they thought it would then be legal to sell the drugs. And they were trying to produce heroin substitutes. Unfortunately, what happened is one of the problems you can have with these drugs. And it's why I liken using these drugs to playing Russian roulette. They did not carry the chemical synthesis out properly. They didn't do the steps correctly. And as a result, there was a byproduct, a contaminant in the product. That contaminant destroyed the same part of the brain that's destroyed in Parkinson's disease. So back then, the emergency room doctors in Los Angeles saw this epidemic of people in their 20s with Parkinson's disease, and at first they were puzzled until they realized they were all heroin addicts who'd got a hold of these drugs. And so that very early example of synthetic drugs, designer drugs, carries through until today. As I mentioned earlier, these drugs are synthesized by people who often do not know what they're doing. I saw one documentary on this that showed a gentleman in Missouri who literally had a old broken down trailer home on the back 40. He was out there in this old broken down trailer home trying to synthesize and package these drugs. So the issue is, users of these drugs don't know what they're getting from package to package. It could be the same packaging, it could claim to be the same drug, but it could be 10 times more potent, or this time it could have contaminants. So, as with Russian roulette, you might pull the trigger several times and nothing happens, but sooner or later, if you keep doing it, you might kill yourself. It's the same thing with these drugs. You could use them several times, get whatever effect it is people desire when they use these, have no problems, but one time they get a bad batch, and they end up in the emergency room, or they end up dead. There are actually multiple different types of synthetic drugs, but the ones that we've been dealing with here in this state, actually around the country and federally as well, for the last 3 or 4 years, fall into 3 different categories. First, you have the cannabinoids. These are drugs that activate the same receptors in the brain as THC, which is the main active ingredient in marijuana. They're usually marketed as herbal incense, and supposedly That's what people are supposed to use them for. You'll also see with all these synthetic drugs very prominently placed on the label, not for human consumption. That is not simply an attempt to get around any lawsuits that they might encounter from selling the product and having people develop these adverse reactions and suing them. It goes beyond that. And the reason is the way that the federal analog provision is worded. And the federal analog provision makes drugs that are chemically and pharmacologically similar to scheduled substances, also controlled substances, but only if they're intended for human use. And so they put this on there to really try to avoid federal prosecution, to claim this is not for human use. But, you know, it's like out of an old Monty Python sketch. It's sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Everyone knows what's going on. I mean, everyone who sells this and buys this knows exactly that it's for human use. When you get to the bath salts, which I'll talk about in a minute, I was once interviewed jointly with Dan Morin, who's the DEA special agent in charge in Minneapolis, and they had done the calculations. And his question, I can't remember the exact amount, but his question was, how many people would pay $1,500 an ounce for bath salts? Never saw any products that expensive at Bed and Bath. The production of the synthetic cannabinoids, again, they synthesize the chemical, they get a powder, they dissolve the powder in some solvent, typically acetone, and then they spray the material or that resultant solution on plant material of some sort, let it dry off, and that leaves a chemical residue. It leaves the powder on the plant material, and then it's sold. And actually, the next speaker is going to have some photos for you. I've seen her PowerPoint. She's going to have some photos of how these products actually look, so I didn't include any here. But it is typically smoked. It is used as if it were marijuana. There have been reports of all sorts of medical problems with these drugs, vomiting. Up at that hearing in Duluth, people talked about having to avoid the pink vomit on the street. Vomiting, heart attacks, seizures, agitation, and psychosis. But these are things you don't typically see with regular marijuana use, unless the marijuana itself has been contaminated with some adulterant like PCP. So the synthetic cannabinoids, really, one of the things I always emphasize is they can't be equated with marijuana. They are far more dangerous than marijuana is. And so I was very actually glad to see that the legislature made sale of them a felony. The second major category are the stimulants, and as that name implies, they mimic the effects of cocaine and amphetamines. They hit the same receptors in the brain that cocaine and amphetamines affect. These are often marketed as bath salts, and I've alluded to that already, but they're also marketed as plant food, research chemicals, and a relatively new one I thought was kind of interesting. They're marketed as cell phone screen scratch removers. I'm not quite sure where that comes. These are also sometimes smoked. Sometimes they're insufflated, which is just snorting. They're used IV occasionally, and they've even been used rectally. With these, any stimulants like these can cause, as the name implies, stimulation of all your bodily functions. So you can get a rapid heart rate, high blood pressure, you have trouble breathing, extreme sweating, again, agitation, psychosis, prolonged severe panic attacks, and also, most distressingly, self-inflicted wounds and suicide. And I think these were the drugs that may have been used in some of the cases that the emergency room doctors in Duluth were talking about. The third major category are the hallucinogens, which mimic the effects of LSD. These are also like the bath salts, or like the stimulants marketed as bath salts and research chemicals. These drugs are very, very potent, which means a very small quantity is needed, and in that way they are like LSD. So like LSD, they're typically put on some sort of blotter paper. The other thing that happens with these particular drugs is if you actually ingest them, your body does not really absorb them well, or actually your body does absorb them, but your liver immediately deactivates them. So to get around that, people take these little blotters and they put them under the tongue or in the buccal cavity, which is the space between your gums and cheek, and they absorb the drug that way. And that avoids, since the blood here doesn't immediately go to your liver, like the blood from your intestinal tract does, that lets them get this drug into their system without it being chewed up right away. These, though, are sometimes also smoked or injected IV. These cause nausea and vomiting. All these drugs seem to do that. And as you might expect from this class of drugs, hallucinations, anxiety, panic attacks again, psychotic symptoms and seizures, and deaths have also been reported, including several cases in Minnesota and eastern North Dakota. The sort of mass overdose that resulted in one death in Blaine a couple years back was from 2CE, which is a hallucinogen. The other thing, if you're familiar with the history of LSD, you may know that some people who use LSD subsequently have what are known as flashbacks. They have temporary periods of time long after they've used the drug when they get that same experience that they had when they were high, even though they're not using the drugs. These drugs are actually a little bit more frightening because in addition to having flashbacks, what can happen with these drugs is they can cause permanent hallucinatory effects, permanent changes in visual perception that don't go away. Flashbacks usually come and go. If someone is unfortunate enough to develop these permanent visual effects, they're indefinite. They can last for a very long time. And Mr. Diebel already went over my next couple of slides, so I won't go over this too much. Just one thing I will mention is that I'd heard anecdotally, most of the information that we actually get at the Board of Pharmacy about street drugs actually comes from law enforcement. Although the synthetic cannabinoids, we actually first heard about that from a reporter from a Fargo newspaper. But most of the time, law enforcement officials, county prosecutors will call us up and they will say, there's this new street drug out there, can you do something? You can put it in the schedules. And so we have pretty regular contact with law enforcement and prosecutors, and what we've heard through at least some of them is the problem with the analog provision, which was modeled after federal laws. It's a two-pronged test, basically. You have to show that the chemical structure is similar to something that's already scheduled. But you also, and that's the easy part, typically. Typically, they can get an expert to come in and testify, yes, we've analyzed the drug, we know what the chemical structure is, it is structurally very similarly related to this drug in Schedule 1. The second part's the difficulty, where you have to have an expert potentially testify that the drug is pharmacologically similar. The reason for that is many of these drugs have never been studied in humans. We know anecdotally what the effects are because of people that end up in emergency rooms. Some of them, particularly the synthetic cannabinoids, have been studied in lab animals extensively, and we know what receptors they hit in the brains of rats. But they really haven't been studied that much in humans, so it's more difficult to get an expert in pharmacology to come forward and say, yes, I can definitively state that this drug has the same pharmacological effect as this drug in the schedule. So one of the things that happened in 2012 to try to deal with that is, again, what Mr. Diebel described, and just a little bit of history about that. When we started getting calls, I think both at the legislature and at the board, that prosecutors were having difficulty with the analog provisions, I think we started to look at, well, what else could be done? And we started looking at what other states and even what other countries have done. And we ended up using an approach in 2012 that was first used in the United Kingdom and then by other states, including Kansas, eventually North Dakota. And that is, in addition to adding literally dozens of specific drugs to Schedule 1, for the synthetic cannabinoids and for the stimulants, chemical classes were added. With the cannabinoids, it was 8 classes. There were 7 well-defined and 1 catch-all miscellaneous class. The idea was to get around the second prong of the analog test, which is at this point, if you can show that a drug is in one of those 7 categories, and there's one category of stimulants, if you can show that a drug is in one of those chemical categories and it's been manipulated in certain ways, it's automatically a Schedule I controlled substance. There's no need to prove the pharmacological effect. And so that was an attempt to try to get around a problem that the prosecutors were facing. The other thing that was already mentioned is with the synthetic cannabinoids, the penalty for selling was increased to a felony, which I think was very appropriate. The board was given expedited rulemaking authority that expires in 2014, and the rules do have to be ratified by the legislature during the next session, or they are nullified. We had actually not used that. We started using the expedited rulemaking process last summer after this was passed. We had discussions again with prosecutors and law enforcement with BCA. And the rulemaking authority requires us to demonstrate several things. So even though it's expedited, we still have to do the research. We have to show that we have to research the chemical structure. We do have to research the pharmacology to show that it's potentially abusable. And we also have to show that it causes harm. So we have to find evidence somewhere of people being admitted to emergency rooms, having adverse effects. And then we also have to show that it is present and actively being sold in Minnesota. So we were doing that research, and we were about to actually publish the necessary paperwork in the state register when another huge disaster for us hit, and that was the compounding crisis. There was a pharmacy in Massachusetts that was really acting as a manufacturer, and they produced 17,000 doses of IV drug that was contaminated with a particularly serious fungus. And we had 12 cases in Minnesota, 50 people around the country died. And I literally spent 50 to 60% of my time for the next 6 months trying to deal with that. And so what we did instead is we went to the legislature again, and those drugs that we were going to put into the schedule by the expedited rulemaking are now in schedule because of legislative action. We are currently, though, working on expedited rulemaking right now, because late in the session we became aware, again through the discussions that we've had with law enforcement and BCA, of a few new products that really need to be scheduled. And so that process should be done, I hope, by the time the legislature's in session. The current problems really are the problems that we've had all along since this latest version of the crisis started in 2010, 2011, is producers continue to tweak the molecules to try to get around any law changes that the legislature makes or anything that the board does in rule. This has often been referred to as the whack-a-mole problem. I mean, every time you stomp something down, something else pops up. I'm not sure that there's a lot more that we can do about that particular problem other than continuing what we're doing. And actually, as early as 2011, the legislators that were working on this, senators, representatives, both parties, and I think the folks from the BCA were saying the same thing. This is going to happen. It's really impossible because of the thousands of possible chemical compounds to entirely prevent this problem, and that's why the expedited rulemaking authority was requested, and that's why we need to, I think, continue to add more substances to the schedules. Another problem that I personally had hoped would be dealt with by now simply by having the criminal penalties there was that, the hope was that the stores in Minnesota that were selling these products would stop doing it because they would actually be afraid of spending time in jail or prison, the owners would. Again, there's anecdotal evidence that at least partially worked, that a lot of the tobacco shops and some of the music shops and even truck stops that might have been selling it did conclude it was not worth a jail sentence to try to sell these products. But we know the shop in Duluth. I think there's one in Brainerd. I think there's problems in Winona. So there are still retail outlets in Minnesota. And again, right from the beginning, what we've tried to, we, meaning I think the legislators that have worked on this and the Board of Pharmacy and the other experts, have tried to point out that what a state can do is that we can try to regulate what happens in the retail outlets in the state. Still another problem, and that's the continued availability of the drugs on the internet. Now, even what we do here has an effect there, because there are some of the companies that manufacture this that will not ship into states if they know that a particular substance is banned. So it even has some impact there, but a lot of these products are actually produced in China or India, and they come across the border, they're hard to interdict, and so that's still going to be an issue. And then the other issue is that people continue using the drugs. So a lot of what the board does is on the supply side. We work to try to reduce the supply that's available, and I think it's also critical to work on the demand side. And the Board of Pharmacy is one of the state agencies that is participating in the DHS-led effort to have a state substance abuse strategy. And the steering committee met just last week, and this is one of the issues we talked about. And I think that, I won't speak for them, but I think that DHS and Health Department, I think they have some ideas on prevention and education, and I think that's going to be a very, very key thing, is to try to do prevention and education and try to convince particularly kids, teenagers, to not use these drugs, to really get the message across about how dangerous they are. So additional actions, again, it needs to be a multifaceted approach. I already actually talked about this a little bit. In terms of the Board of Pharmacy specifically, the Attorney General had some specific recommendations about the board and actually about what cities and what the legislature could do. And the board does support what the Attorney General put in her report. One would be to make the expedited rulemaking authority permanent. The other would be to remove the provision requiring legislative approval, although that may not be as critical because, as Mr. Gavel mentioned, it's been very rare over the years for the legislature to not reaffirm what the board has done in rule. The other thing that the Attorney General recommends is cease and desist authority, which basically would allow the board, under certain specified circumstances when we had adequate proof that something legal was going on, would be to issue a cease and desist order, and then it would be the business that received the cease and desist order then would have the burden of going to court and showing why we were wrong and shouldn't have issued the order. We do not have that authority right now. Another idea that I had, and I've been mulling around for a while now, both in this context and in the context of another thing that was recently in the news, which was the incident or the raid that happened at the Mungtown marketplace, where a lot of drugs were seized and other chemicals were seized. Revolves around the board's existing embargo authority. So the Board of Pharmacy has the authority to go into any place in the state in which drugs are stored and from which they are sold or distributed or vended. Now this was really meant and was written for us to go into the places we actually license: pharmacies, drug manufacturers, and drug wholesalers. And it was meant so that if we went into a pharmacy and we noticed that they hadn't checked the temperatures in their refrigerators for 2 months, we could go in and say, you know, really, you have no way of knowing if those refrigerated drugs are safe. You have to not sell those. So the problem is that there are some exceptions written in here, and I've had discussions with the Attorney General and their staff that would make it difficult to use that authority in a situation like Duluth at this point. There would be some arguments that they could make back to challenge our authority. But we have the authority to go in to any place that drugs are stored, to inspect the drugs, to look at everything but financial records. So we can look at invoicing, where the drugs come from, all that sort of thing. We can take samples and have the samples analyzed. And then there are two provisions that really date back in this country all the way back to 1938, when the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was passed by the federal government. There are two things that two basic things that go wrong with drugs. One is they're misbranded, which means the labeling is incorrect. So the labeling is such that people can't use the product safely. The others are adulterated, which either means they're contaminated, or the other half is they're not manufactured to FDA standards, and they're not manufactured to current good manufacturing procedures. So the board has the authority, if it finds that when it goes in on an inspection, if it finds that a drug is adulterated or misbranded, we have the authority to embargo the drug, which means we tell the owner, you cannot sell this drug product, and you cannot remove it until either the board tells you you can dispose of it, or the court tells you that you dispose of it. And then we have 60 days to go to district court to get the court to issue an order of condemnation. So if we actually could use, if it weren't for these exceptions that make this authority difficult to use, and if you consider that the products that are being sold in the last place on the earth are drugs, we could potentially go in there, say these are drugs, we want to sample, have them analyzed, and determine if they're properly labeled according to federal and state law, properly manufactured according to federal and state law. If they're not, we could embargo the drugs, go to district court, and try to get an order of condemnation. So that actually might literally get the product off the shelf. And that's really all I have, and I'll take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Doctor. We've got a couple of questions. Representative Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Weiberg, you always give us good information. I was impressed in Duluth, and I'm more impressed today. And I got a couple of things I want to ask you. I've got a couple of things I want to ask you about. You in Duluth, you mentioned you had an idea that you weren't willing to share up in Duluth because you had to do some more research and investigation, and I'm not, those kind of issues. So the idea you had in Duluth that you didn't share, is this the embargo thing? Is it you're sharing right now?
Mr. Chair, Representative Ward, yes, that's what it is. Right, and the reason I think I can share it now is I have had discussions with the Attorney General and their staff, and we don't think that we can use it in a way that it might withstand legal challenge, it might not. And so I think I can mention it now and get that idea out there and starting to percolate.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Ward.
Thank you. So, Dr. Weber, you're not sure that will, I thought I heard you say that you thought that, using this embargo idea, maybe be able to eliminate a lot of the product right off the shelf. You're not sure of that, or you are sure of that?
Dr. Weiber. Representative Ward, we don't, after the discussions with the Attorney General's office, we don't think we can do it right now because there are some exceptions. There's an exceptions area in Chapter 151, which is our Practice Act, basically. There's some exceptions in there that can be used, and there's some issues with the definition of the word drug that we'd have to overcome. So we think that there would need to be some legislative change next session before we can do that.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Ward.
Thank you. Dr. Weiberg, that's exactly what I was wondering, is if there's some legislative, something statutory that we could do to help in this process, and that sounds like a good suggestion. Also, Dr. Weiberg, I want to go back to when you mentioned the compound problem from out east, I think it was. Yeah. That was related to eye injections, was it not? Or am I not accurate on that?
Mr. Chair, Representative Ward, it was not, fortunately. The specific product that was contaminated was an injectable steroid product that's used to reduce inflammation. And most of the injections actually happened into the skin or around the spine. And so most of the people that developed the fungal infections had infections in or around their spine, some in their knees. We were very fortunate, though, because as a result of the investigation that both the Health Department and the Board did, we realized that this company out east was illegally shipping, despite actually having received a warning letter from us, because we suspected they were doing what they were doing, but we couldn't prove it. They shipped various types of compounded drug products to over 115 different healthcare providers in Minnesota, including mini doses of a drug called Avastin, which is injected into the eye. And it's just very fortunate that that wasn't contaminated with a fungus as well.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Ward.
Thank you. And Doctor, asked that because I just recently met with another medical physician would you repeat the product? Is it Avastin?
Avastin.
Avastin. That's exactly what I just met and talked to him about that. So is that completely solved now?
Mr. Chair, Representative Ward, one of the reasons I could not focus as much on this issue is the board did have legislation dealing with the compounding issue that was passed. We are in the process of essentially what that legislation allows us to do is scrutinize out-of-state facilities much more than we've done in the past. We already routinely inspect all facilities that are within the state that we license. We inspect them before they get open, and we inspect them periodically. It turns out other states don't do that. And so now we're going to be able to require them to be inspected. There is more work to be done. We're waiting a little bit to see what Congress does. The Avastin issue is a very thorny, tricky issue to deal with. But we are very much aware that it's an issue, and we're trying to work on solutions that will be satisfactory to the ophthalmologist but still keep patients safe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to finish up here, but I still have a question on it, if I could, please.
Representative Ward.
Thank you. And, Doctor, thank you for that. And I also was informed or knew of there is federal pending legislation regarding this issue. But my question to you is, as I heard you say, when that happened, your labs kind of focused, not kind of, absolutely focused on that issue only, and you weren't able to do anything with synthetics or any other issue that you should have been dealing with. And that is concerning to this legislator. You know, from the standpoint of we have an issue here that needs to be dealt with, but all of a sudden we have some other major issues that are not going to be dealt with. So, Doctor, what needs to happen? I mean, that's concerning to me, and I hope to all of us that you know, all of a sudden, you know, this. So why can't you take care of that issue that's very important, but there are also very important issues, synthetics and others that are going on that aren't going to be taken care of? What?
Mr. Chair, Representative Ward, we're really concerned about it. The board's very concerned about it. Part of the legislative change, or the legislative package that we had this year, is we requested and received an increase in our appropriation so that we could hire 2 additional pharmacists. One is going to be a surveyor that'll be necessary to do the extra work on vetting all of these out-of-state pharmacies. In relation to this issue, the real problem is we're relatively small agencies. Even when we hire some new people by this fall, we have 18 people. And I am the primary, in addition to being the chief administrative officer for the agency, like a commissioner basically, and all the other duties I have to do, I do almost all of the policy work and all the rulemaking. So this was kind of the final straw where this can't happen anymore for me as well. And so we're going to be hiring a deputy director, and that deputy director, if this situation would happen again, I would continue working on one of the 2 issues, maybe the synthetic drugs, and I would turn to the deputy and say, you need to handle the compounding issue. So we're going to now have 2 people that are dedicated to working on these policy issues. And we think that'll be enough, although currently we have 8 or 9 distinct major policy issues we're working on. But I think that's what's going to be the solution. And in fact, we just got permission from management and budget to hire those 2 people, and the postings went up yesterday. And so I'm hoping that that will be sufficient, and if we keep getting more and more issues to work on, we may have to come back again to the legislature to get even additional staff. But believe me, that was a really big concern for me as well.
Thank you, Doctor, and Mr. Chair, members. I just, you know, I think that truly does set the reality of some seriousness, not just with synthetic drugs, but with issues in the state of Minnesota on a number of, you know, pharmaceutical issues that could be critical to our whole state and all the citizens of the state of Minnesota. So thank you for bringing that forward, Doctor, and thank you for allowing me, Mr. Chair, the opportunity to question that significantly.
Representative Schoen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Weiberg, I'm going to start at the end of Representative Ward's questioning and just talk about a piece here. You're adding a couple pharmacists, but it sounds like we almost need to add an investigative piece, and somehow we need to figure out a way, and I know the BCA is stretched as well, but we need to talk to Special Agent Marquardt here, and I think he's in the room here somewhere, but you know, I think we need some investigative piece, and if we need to add a couple agents over there to handle some of the issues related to, you know, folks sending in the wrong stuff or this synthetic piece, that's going to be an important thing to talk about, and that may be a very big deal. That doesn't mean that they're Board of Pharmacy employees. They might work at the BCA, but we need to figure something out, like a task force, a diversion task force, or whatever that happens to be, because I think we're doing that in the insurance fraud group as well, too. However, one of the things I'm curious about, I want to know from you whether you think the clarifying embargo authority or the cease and desist authority, sorry, I can't talk, it's too early in the morning, I'm working nights for the summer to help cover, which is going to be stronger and which is going to be better, or do they work together? And working together, what will be stronger and quicker?
Mr. Chair, Representative Schoen, just to address the first part of your comments, I've thought about the possibility of adding different types of investigators over there. At this point, without the until we get changes in the embargo language, if that's what the legislature decides to do, I don't know that we need more investigative staff, because it's not really clear that we have the authority to go into places like the last place on earth. However, part of the process, part of the request to the legislature would be, if we are granted embargo authority, or enhanced embargo authority and cease and desist authority, would probably be to have additional investigative staff, because this would open up not huge, but more work than we've done, in a different sort of work. And so I've you know, our inspectors are pharmacists. There are some state boards of pharmacy around the country that do hire law enforcement officers to do some of their investigations. Typically those are boards that are also the official state's controlled substance authority, where they actually go in and investigate controlled substance thefts and that sort of thing. So I've thought about that as being something that might be necessary if we move down that path with enhanced embargo authority. In regards to cease and desist versus embargo, I think they're complementary. I think the cease and desist has the potential, perhaps, to work in tandem with the embargo authority, in that we might use the, well, I think it would move in tandem with one aspect of that increased embargo authority that we want. That would be making it real clear that we had the authority to go into a place like this in the first place. So I think we would need to go into a place like this in the first place to actually see what the product is. And then I think what we could do is really two approaches at once. We could more immediately, I think, issue a cease and desist order, and then start the process with the district court. So I think they could be complementary.
Representative Schoen.
Mr. Chair and Dr. Weiberg, how do you think we can affect the retail side of this quickly? And I'm going to fully understand that we can talk about how we know we're not going to 100% prevent it from coming in on the internet. I mean, you know, we don't have brothels in Minnesota, but you can get on Craigslist and Backpages and hire services in that fashion as well, too, on the internet. But how do we stop it at the storefront as quickly as possible under what you envision? Because that's the biggest deal. I mean, when you talk about going to Duluth, or you go to talk about Representative Ward's district and formerly mine as well, too, that when you're dealing with people having seizures on a regular basis, that's concentrated. And for the city of Duluth and Brainerd and Winona as well, when you have a business district where people don't want to go to because they're avoiding people, you have the city of Duluth moved a bus stop. People have to walk around and vomit. We're hearing about the increased costs on our medical services, where people are gouging out their eyes and just having a range of problems that are just unspeakable. How do we affect that concentrated shop the quickest in your mind? And I realize that we're doing everything we can, and I know you are too, within your resources. But can you give me a little guidance on where we can go, or what you might think? Because I think we're trying to pull out all the stops here.
Mr. Chair, Representative Schoen, again, as I mentioned in one of my slides, I think it's a multifaceted approach. And actually and this is not my area of expertise, but having read through the Attorney General's report, I think some of the more immediate steps might be something that the cities can do, some ordinances that they might be able to pass. If we're talking about real immediate, before the legislature, can amend some statutes. In terms of the board's involvement, I think what I've already talked about. I would, again, we, meaning everyone who's worked on this, the legislature and the experts in the agencies, we're hoping that simply making the sale of these illegal would dissuade a lot of retailers, and we think a lot of the smaller town retailers would. I was personally hoping that when the sale of the synthetic cannabinoids went from gross misdemeanor to felony, that the gentleman up in Duluth would not want to risk a felony conviction, but he continues. One would, again, this is a hope, unless he finds some way to deal with this, is if the board did have cease and desist or embargo authority, basically not being able to reliably keep product on his shelf and risk having it seized. And by the way, the embargo authority basically says that if the district court orders the condemnation, the seller has to pay for the destruction of it and all the legal costs. And so, again, that might be a disincentive. Are any of those going to be really quick in terms of months? No. But was interviewed for a story on KSP5 last night. This was Representative Simonson. And we both, it turns out, made the same remark. I'm hopeful that with the actions that can be taken, that maybe a year from now, we can get rid of the retail sales.
Representative Schoen.
And one final one, Mr. Chair and Dr. Weibert. When you mentioned the embargo authority, I think, was that the 60-day issue, or there was a 60-day window where, and then you leave the product in the store? So here's my curiosity, Dr. Weibert. If we know it's dangerous and maybe you don't have the authority to remove it, and I think that's something else we need to be able to look at as well, and that would be, if we had investigators and we worked in conjunction with the BCA to make some sort of task force, you'd be able to call those folks in and say, we need to seize this. They have the appropriate facilities to hold the evidence, although evidence holding is at a premium in many places as well, too. But, that kind of concerns me as well, just leaving it behind, and if it's a safety issue. So somehow, when you come with your recommendations, I'd like to see something in there where we give you the authority to seize and hold that product, whatever it may be. If you're deeming it unsafe, I don't know that we should be leaving it. Well, I would prefer not to leave it in the store, and I understand your resources and needs and wanting to be careful with that. But
Mr. Chair, Representative Schoen, that is something that was, I think, discussed either at the hearing or when I had subsequent discussions with the Attorney General and their staff. Unlike the FDA, the board does not have the authority to actually seize the product. When we embargo it, we literally hand the seller a notice that they cannot sell it, that it's illegal to remove it. The problem is it's only a misdemeanor if they dispose of it. The FDA has the ability to actually seize product when they go in and they find that, even if they go into a registered manufacturing plant and they just find that the manufacturing conditions are in shoddy shape, they can actually seize the product, and then it's incumbent on the manufacturer in that case to go to court. They have to take the action to go to court to get it back. And so, yeah, that is part of the thought process, and I'm going to be working much more closely with the Attorney General's office on the exact language.
Representative Lohmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much, Dr. Weiberg, for your presentation today. It was very, very informative, and I really thank you for all the work that you're doing. My question has to do with the analog language, and that was passed in 2011, and I guess I'm just wondering if that's helped, or prosecutors using that, or are they still reticent to use that?
Mr. Chair, Representative, I'm not 100% sure, because a lot of what I get is anecdotal evidence. I know early on, most of the feedback I was getting from the county attorneys that I talked to was they found it difficult to use because they found it difficult to get expert testifiers. However, I think it might be starting to be used, and I've also heard, although I admit I haven't confirmed this, that the DEA may have some resources available to help prosecutors. They may have some expert witnesses that might be willing to testify. But most of what I've heard, unfortunately, is that the prosecutors have had some difficulty getting the expert witnesses to show that it acts on the brain the same way that a scheduled drug works.
Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Weiberg. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. Basically, you have a two-tiered or two-step testing process. First step, as you said, was to identify the chemical structure, which is relatively easy to do. That really isn't the issue. The issue that, according to my understanding, that you're facing here is proving the pharmacological structure, otherwise known as the lab rat test. How do we expedite that? And is that, listening to you speak here, the pharmacological test, or that threshold that we have to pass here, is that something on the federal level? That seems to me to be the big roadblock here. Is yeah, we can identify the chemical structure, but does it really have the effect here? What is the general time frame, and how big? Describe this roadblock to me.
Mr. Chair, Representative Newberg, it's a very significant roadblock, unfortunately, because with the first test, identifying the chemical structure, labs, including the BCA lab, can relatively simply, the next speaker will address that maybe more, but and I think they have some resource issues as well. But what you're doing there is you're just identifying the structure. The problem with the second part is showing that it's pharmacologically the same. It's not a matter really of actually doing a test. It's a matter of having research having been done already somewhere. And that's the real problem. The synthetic cannabinoids, because THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, actually, it is available as an FDA-approved drug. A purified form is available as an FDA-approved drug because it is effective in reducing nausea and vomiting and in promoting, if someone has certain disorders that cause them to lose a lot of weight, it helps improve their appetite, and they can keep weight on. So it's actually approved. And so there's a lot of information about that particular synthetic version of THC. Because of that, I'd say 20 or 25 years ago, a lot of the pharmaceutical manufacturers started synthesizing these cannabinoid analogs, and they started testing them, but most of the testing never got past the lab rat stage. Most of it never got to human testing. And that's the problem, is you don't have that. And so what you have instead, which would sort of be the gold standard, I mean, if you did human testing and you had a well-controlled study, you could say much more precisely how it affects the body. Instead, I think what you have to rely on is more anecdotal evidence, which is not as reliable. So someone shows up in an emergency room in Duluth or Brainerd, and the physician believes that this particular drug was involved and it had these effects. You can build up case reports like that, and eventually, with those case reports, you might be able to get an expert that says, enough people have showed up in hospitals around the country where this drug has been identified and it's had these effects. So yeah, I think it does have the pharmacological effect. But the real problem there is, and why, again, these drugs are so dangerous, is they haven't really been studied in humans.
Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So really, that's the relative unknown is the timeline as far as getting past that second parameter, that second criteria, the pharmacological test. I just want to back up for a second. What I'm trying to help me understand here is we have, you said that we have the three types of synthetic drugs here. We have the synthetic cannabinoids, which is understandable. You have which is based on the organically grown or marijuana. But the stimulants and the hallucinogens, especially want to focus on the synthetic hallucinogens, the hallucinogenic compounds that mimic LSD. What's the difference between, because what we have here with LSD in its purest form is it's basically a compound that's synthesized in a lab. So what we're doing is we're taking a variation thereof, LSD, that is also synthesized in the lab. So what we have is an artificial product, and we're synthesizing another artificial product. Why is that an issue? Why can't we just take if we have a three-pronged approach, you go after each individual one, but I would think that the synthetic LSD forms of what's out there on the street would probably be the easiest ones to go after. Am I correct?
Mr. Chair, Representative Newberger, not necessarily easier to go after, because you still have, if you're talking about the analog test, you still have the same issue, which is, even LSD itself, when it first came out, it actually was studied in humans quite a bit. And so there was quite a bit known about it. But the problem is when the people that make these drugs start tweaking the molecule, and the molecule gets further away from the LSD structure, and they're not all related to LSD structurally. Many of those drugs, again, have not been really studied in humans in a systematic way. Now, there's this one gentleman who was a pharmacologist who, I guess, in a way studied it because he synthesized a whole series of these compounds and tested them on himself, and then wrote very lengthy descriptions about what he experienced. But you still need to have an expert that's willing to say, yes, this chemical, which is different structurally than LSD, still nevertheless has that same effect as LSD. So it still can be an issue if you're talking about the analog.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Doctor. And I just got a couple of comments, if you would just bear with me. And I never like to let an opportunity go by without making this point, and hopefully you'll help me today. But as I've talked to a number of folks, both across the state in the general public, as well as actual legislators, I think that there is a real misunderstanding out there, if you will, especially when you use the term synthetic marijuana, and you have a conversation with somebody that's not familiar with it. They immediately think that it's like marijuana. and that the effects of using the drug is similar to the effects of using marijuana. And I think you and I both know that that is very far from the truth, and I would just like you to take, a few seconds and support the idea that what we're talking about here is very far from the simple, if you will, effects of marijuana as most of us know it.
Mr. Chair, I would be glad to do that. Actually, since the beginning of this process, when we started working on it several years ago, I've really tried to make that point in many different venues. I've been interviewed a number of times by the press about this, and I've actually gone to the point, and maybe I can make that point again here today, is, I know there may be a need to simplify things for the audience, but do not call these drugs fake pot or fake marijuana, because that does equate them with marijuana, and they are far, far more dangerous. Marijuana itself is a plant, but unlike these drugs where it's a plant, it's not a plant with artificial chemicals sprayed on it. It has a bunch of chemically active compounds in it, but it is a natural product, basically. With what happens with these synthetic cannabinoids, it would be like taking some of the active ingredients in marijuana, concentrating them, and as a result, you get a much more dramatic effect. These products can be many times more potent than the active ingredient THC of marijuana. They can be far more potent. And, if people are used to getting a certain effect from a certain amount of marijuana, and they're equating these with marijuana, and they're using the same amount, they actually may be getting a substantially greater pharmacological effect. The receptors in their brain essentially may be hit by a lot more drug molecules, basically, and a lot more potent molecules that affect the receptors in a way to make both the so-called positive effects that people use it for, plus the adverse effects, much more pronounced. That's one thing. The other thing is not just the chemicals themselves, but again, what I mentioned before, how they're produced. These drugs are not produced in FDA-registered laboratories up to what are called current good manufacturing procedures. They're not using all the safeguards that should be used. They're not making sure that the synthetic process that they use, the chemical process that they use, is always carried out reliably time and time again. And that means that the people who use these products can't know from batch to batch, from package to package, exactly what they're getting. They could use it several times and have whatever effect it is that they desire and not have any bad results. But the next time that they use it, it could be much more potent than the last batch, or it could have a contaminant in it that is itself toxic. And so, these products are far, far more dangerous than regular marijuana is.
Thank you. And, just a couple of final points, then we'll let you go. But as we move forward, I think one of the things that the committee will be looking at is those series of recommendations from the Attorney General's office, some of which, clearly would impact the Board of Pharmacy. But I would just like you to keep in the back of your mind, because I'm sure we'll be working together over the interim here to come up with something. But keep in the back of your mind that we're going to have to put together a fiscal note for whatever legislative changes we recommend, essentially. So if we're asking your board to take on more responsibilities or take a more active role in something, that's something that we're going to have to consider as a legislature going forward. So I'd just like to keep that in your mind. And then my final point, Doctor, if you would, we've talked a little bit about the current laws on the books, the analog laws more specifically. And I think that the general concurrence is that these are really good laws, and they're effective at what they do. And no matter what we do in terms of other outside-the-box thinking, those laws will have to continue going forward. That will be a never-ending process. Is that a fair statement?
Mr. Chair, that's a fair statement. I was talking to someone earlier about this, and the the term war on drugs was coined, I think, back in the 70s, and I think that's really a bad analogy. Wars typically have some sort of an end. The problem with drug abuse, any sort of drug abuse, and the other major area of drug abuse, another major policy issue we're working on with the board and with the other agencies is prescription drug abuse, which is epidemic. They're public health issues. They're law enforcement issues, yes, but they're also public health issues. And that really means that it's a long-term approach you have to do. Certainly in this situation, we need to move as quickly as we can to deal with the retail sale of these products. But even after the retail sale is gone, which I think it will be, there's still the possibility of getting it over the internet. And so this is something where everyone involved, the legislature, all the agencies involved, private sector, treatment programs and outreach programs, everyone is going to have to take a real comprehensive approach, and it will be something that has to continue on, and we will have to continue probably coming back. And we've actually said that all along, that we probably have to come back and as fast as they tweak their molecules, we need to tweak the laws and rules. So yeah, it's going to be an ongoing process.
Thank you, Doctor. Appreciate your testimony today. Violet Stevens with the BCA. Good morning. Welcome to the committee.
Good morning. My name is Violet Stevens, and I'm a forensic scientist with the BCA Forensic Science Service Laboratory. Design of drugs encompasses a plethora of drugs as well as drug groups. For this presentation, I will focus on the synthetic cannabinoids, the bath salts, and a few other drugs of emerging trends. The synthetic cannabinoids, they're commonly sold as spices or K2, and they're usually packaged such as we see here. They, as Dr. Weiberg mentioned, they are compounds that's sprayed on plant material, and they're usually placed on a drying rack such as this to dry out. Or they can occur in powder form. With these substances, one of the problems is that first, people who are buying these substances but don't know what they're buying, and the people who are selling it don't exactly know what they're selling. And part of the reason is because of the variability that goes from label to label, as well as from product to product. So what one person buys today in a package such as this container, spice container, may contain one synthetic cannabinoid, and coming back the next day and buying the same product could result in different cannabinoids. John W. Hoffman is a scientist at Clemson University, and in 1995, he and his team tried to characterize the receptors where these drugs binds to by comparing the potency at this receptor site with that of THC. So synthesized compounds and synthetic cannabinoids were compared to THC at this receptor site. And he developed quite a lot of compounds, and they were subsequently named for him: JWH, John W. Hoffman, and they were sequentially numbered. there are over 300 of these JWH compounds. The same can be said for Alexandros Makrianis, AM. He worked with AM2201. And there are a few compounds that were produced by Pfizer. They're labeled with CP compounds and so forth. This is just a timeline that shows from the time THC was isolated to when the CB receptor sites were isolated and discovered. And John W. Hoffman started his research in 1995. And it goes through to when the state started to legislate these synthetic cannabinoids. I just want to point out and emphasize that synthetic cannabinoids are in no way, shape, or form synthetic marijuanas. The site that the synthetic cannabinoids are attracted to are the CB1 receptor site, which is the same site that the THC is attracted to, and that's the only reason why they're looked at as synthetic marijuana or synthetic cannabinoids. For example, THC at that receptor site is the affinity is measured in nanomoles, and a low affinity means that a low nanomole count means that it has a higher affinity, and vice versa. So at that CB1 receptor site, delta-9 THC has an affinity constant of 10.2, whereas JW8018 has an affinity constant of 2.9, which is 3.5 times as potent as the delta-9 THC, and HU210 has an affinity of 0.06, which means that it's like 170 times more potent than delta-9, the THCs at that site. Again, the structure in the middle is that of tetrahydrocannabinol, and as you can see, the structures that surround this structure in the middle, which are the classes that the synthetic cannabinoids, these are the core groups belonging to the classes of synthetic cannabinoids. They bear no resemblance to THC. In 2011, the legislature, Minnesota legislature, seek to get a hold of this problem by controlling some synthetic cannabinoids, a handful of synthetic cannabinoids, and and some of these fell into some classes, and some were not controlled at all. And the response of the people who are manufacturing these synthetic cannabinoids was to quickly adapt, and they, by tweaking the compound to make different compounds. And as a result, going back to the previous slide, if you see that AM2201 is not listed anywhere in this slide. And as a result, we started seeing in the laboratory AM2201 because it was not listed in the 2011 legislation. In 2012, again, the legislature went ahead and they controlled the classes of drugs, and this way we were able to cover a lot more of the synthetic cannabinoids. And AM2201, which is just an example of one that was showing up because it wasn't controlled in 2011, was placed in the 2012 statute. And again, that's because rather than control a single drug, the classes were controlled. And there were other specifically named drugs that was also controlled in 2012. Again, this graph showed that before the 2012 legislation, AM2201, which was not controlled, we were seeing a lot of that in the laboratory, and after the legislation, we started to see a decline in the amount of AM2201 that we were in the laboratory. This slide just shows the number of cases that we've seen in the laboratory, as well as the counties that they were originating from. As a result of the 2012 legislation, 2 new drugs showed up that were not controlled, and these were XLR11 and UR144. They did not fit in any of the chemical classes that were controlled in 2012. Before 2012, we didn't really see that much XLR11 and a handful of UR144. And after the 2012 legislation, we started seeing quite a bit more of the XLR11 and the UR144. Again, it's a map of the states showing where the total number of cases that we've seen up to date since we started keeping track of these numbers in late 2010 of XLR11 and UR144. But effective August 1st, 2013, XLR11 and UR144 will be added to the list of Schedule I controlled substances. So what I've discussed so far pertains to the synthetic cannabinoids. Going into the bath salts, they are commonly sold as Ivory Wave, Vanilla Sky, and there are a few other names that's associated with the bath salts, and they have no legitimate bath salt use, or they are sometimes labeled as plant food, and they're not legitimately plant food, and they have no accepted medical use. As with the synthetic cannabinoids, the content of these packages can vary from package to package and drug to drug. So what you buy today, you may not get the next day. And as Dr. Weiberg had mentioned, these are labeled as not for human consumption on the back of the packages. Okay, the bath salts, they usually contains compounds such as mephedrone, methadone, MDPV, and these are stimulants, and right now they are controlled on the state level. These, like mephedrone, methadone, and MDPV, are listed in the schedule. There are some bath salts that are not listed in the schedule, but they are still controlled because of the way the law is written. For example, the law says that, statute says that any compound that bears this structure and is substituted at any one of these positions are illegal. Some of the bath salts, such as alpha PVP, which is specifically not listed in the schedule, does have this structure in it, and they are substituted. It's substituted at one or two of these positions. So because of that, it is covered under the statute. This slide was added at a later date, so it may not appear in your packages. Since we started tracking the bath salts and the synthetic cannabinoids, but this pertains to bath salts in 2010, this is before any kind of legislation, we saw just below 10 bath salts. In the year 2011, before the legislation went through, we saw over 98, we analyzed over 90 items of bath salts, and before the 2012 legislation, it dropped. This was the 9 months before the 2012 legislation. It dropped quite a bit, and after the 2012 legislation, it pretty much stays the same. But so far in 2013, the number of items analyzed have dropped, since the 2012 legislation passed. Other designer drugs that we have encountered at the BCA is one called AKB48, Apinaca, which is a synthetic cannabinoid. And we've also encountered a drug that's called 25I-N-Bome. They're otherwise called N-Bome drugs, and this drug was related to the death in North Dakota. Another drug that we've received inquiry about is a synthetic cannabinoid known as PB22. I am a part of affiliated or networked with a scientific group on an international level, and because of that, I'm aware of some drugs that are inquiries are made about some drugs, and BB22 is one of those drugs, as well as 836339. But effective August 1st, 2013, 25I-N-Bome as well as AKB48, a 5-fluor version of AKB48, PB22, and a 5-fluor version of PB22 will be listed in the Schedule I controlled substances. Some of the challenges we face at the BCA is that, some of these newer compounds are not easily identified. And it's also difficult to obtain standards. And when I say standard, I mean that, a reference that we use in the chemistry section to aid in the identification of an unknown compound. And also that it costs 2 to 3 more times than a routine standard. For example, 10 milligrams of methamphetamine standard would cost about $58, whereas a 5 milligram standard of the N-Bome will cost about $285. This slide was added after the packet was made up, but just to show the big picture that in 2012, the synthetic cannabinoids, we report the synthetic cannabinoid and bath salts reported in relation to everything else that we encounter in the lab was approximately 2.6% and 2% respectively. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Stevens. I have a couple of questions, maybe if I could just start, but you showed a couple of slides that indicate by county the number of cases that you're seeing, and I'm assuming that those cases are referenced. Law enforcement has a sample of something that they send to the BCA for you to process. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, Representative, that's correct.
Good, thank you. Do you, in your testing process of trying to identify what it is, do you also measure the potency? And I ask that because what I've heard continuously is that one of the problems with these drugs is that one is never sure, what the dose of the specific drug is that's mixed in with the plant material. While the compound may not change, the amount that they're ingesting may change from day to day or package to package. Do you test for the potency or no?
Mr. Chair, Representatives, I do not test for the potency. I just, if we can, we try to identify the active ingredient in what's submitted.
You talked about the changes that we made in the last session to the statute and some of these things that will be going, or that will be added to the list on August 1st. And I presume that if we come back in a year from now, we'll see less of the UR-144 or the XLR-11, but we're probably going to see something new that's going to increase, correct?
Mr. Chair, Representative, that's, yes, sir.
And are you familiar with the, Ms. Stevens, are you familiar with the report that the Attorney General's office put out recently about recommendations to the legislature, what should be done?
Mr. Chair, Representative, I'm not familiar with that report.
And final question, Ms. Stevens, do you have a sense, or does the BCA have a sense of what we could do, or recommendations about what we could do to help make your job easier and possibly more effective?
Mr. Chair, Representatives, there are more senior representatives from the BCA here, so I would like, with your indulgence, defer those questions to them.
Excellent, thank you. Representative Newberger, was it for Ms. Stevens, or?
Yes.
Okay, we'll just finish with Ms. Stevens, members, if that's all right.
Ms. Stevens, thank you for coming out here. I find your talk intriguing. I do have a medical background. I just wanted to clarify something here. You said something early on in one of the early slides that the synthetic cannabinoids, correct me, I just want to make sure that I got this straight here, that the synthetic cannabinoids aren't true cannabinoids, they're just molecular compounds that target the same receptor sites in the brain. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, Representative, the synthetic cannabinoids targets the sites, the same site as the THC compound.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Newberger.
Thank you. So the answer is yes. They're not true cannabinoids. They're imposter molecules. They target those receptor sites in the brain that, if you smoke marijuana, the THC molecules that get you high, those receptor sites in the brain are the ones that are targeted by these synthetic cannabinoids, even though they're not true cannabinoids. Correct?
Mr. Chair, Representative, that is correct from all the readings that I've done.
Representative Newberger.
Thank you. Ms. Stevens, so then with the bath salts, they also target the same receptor sites. Are those the dopamine receptor sites in the brain? Are you familiar with that? Are those the sites that they're targeted?
Mr. Chair, Representative, I cannot say that it's the dopamine site that they're targeting.
Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess the reason why I'm driving at that is I look at methamphetamine use, and if the synthetic stimulants mimic methamphetamine, and from my background, I know that the methamphetamine destroys receptor sites in essence, it's like throwing jet fuel on a fire. When those type of molecules interact with the receptor sites in the brain, what, in your opinion, what is more destructive to these receptor sites in the brain? Is it the actual methamphetamine or the synthetic stimulants? Which, in your, I'm not going to pin you to this, but in your opinion, which one has more destructive capability to the receptor sites of the brain? Is it actual methamphetamine or the synthetic bath salts?
Mr. Chair, representatives, I am not qualified to answer that question. For that question, I would defer to Dr. Weiberg.
Representative Newberg.
I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Setter, if you could identify yourself for the record, and welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Wade Setter, and I'm the superintendent of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. And the question that you asked earlier that caused me to come up was really what can we do? And I would reinforce what Dr. Weiberg testified to earlier. We've had this discussion over the past couple of years as this problem's continued to grow. And, you know, from our strategy, we see really three approaches that I don't think solve the problem, but are important to continue. One would be continuing ongoing dialogue with Dr. Weiberg's organization as we identify new substances we've not seen before. These are substances that really lend themselves in our ability to be as nimble as possible under a very challenging legal and chemistry pharmacological problem with expedited rulemaking. And I know a couple of years ago when the Board of Pharmacy was giving the expedited rulemaking authority, there was a sunset on that. So that was one of our discussions internally too, is at least it does provide us with some opportunity outside of legislative intervention to take a newly identified substance and add it to the schedule so it's prohibited. And finally, the one strategy that it seems to be absent in Minnesota is a public education strategy. One of the, I think in making reference to the challenges we saw with methamphetamine 10 or 12 years ago, certainly controlling pseudoephedrine at the point of sale was a very important strategy, but public education is one of those components that we're missing in this particular event. I was recently down in Tennessee just to make reference to the challenges that are ongoing with methamphetamine in other parts of the country. We're down to less than 100 methamphetamine labs a year in Minnesota. I was just in Tennessee a month ago. They will hit 3,000 this year. So that problem has not gone away in other parts of the country. We're very fortunate in Minnesota, at least, to have made a positive progress in towards reducing the presence of it. So I would certainly stand for any additional questions, Mr. Chair.
Good, thank you. Any questions from members? Representative Schull.
Mr. Chair and Superintendent Senator, I think you're in the room for some of my conversation earlier and questions, and I guess what I would like you to do is just, if we talked about expanding the authority for the Board of Pharmacy and in some sort of way in conjunction with the BCA, especially in the drug division and a diversion program or working together, would the lab also, would you have room in your evidence storage? I'm not asking you to answer that, but I mean, those are things we need to discuss and make sure that if we were given them the authority to seize product, where would we put it? Is there room for it? I know some of it may have to be refrigerated if it actually came down to be, pointed out whether it was safe or not until it was deemed safe or not. So just make sure that you would be a part of those conversations as well, and it's not just one-sided, to make sure that you have what you need if we actually did those types of things.
Mr. Chair.
Superintendent.
Mr. Chair, Representative Schoen, I was in the room for your conversation. I would just a couple of observations. First of all, we have authority for criminal investigations, so if it's under an administrative process or regulatory process through the Board of Pharmacy, there'd have to be statutory authority to do that. I am not going to answer the question about storing because I have no idea on quantity. It'd be very difficult we don't have the ability to quantify this at this particular point in time. I would suggest, though, that we have been good and I think aggressive partners, not only with the Board of Pharmacy, but with our local law enforcement partners in trying to address this problem. One of the challenges that we see with it, to be quite frank with you, and perhaps this is an oversimplification, but as you've heard today, as these substances are identified and prohibited, then they're altered at the molecular level. And it's a chemistry issue, so in many cases we're trying to prohibit substances that haven't been invented yet. And so I think this is really unique even on a national level and an international level in our discussions. We're not alone anywhere in the United States. I mean, there's other states that are having very much the same problems, and trying to stay ahead of it is a very big challenge for us.
Mr. Chair and Superintendent Setter, you can't oversimplify something for a very simple person like me, so I appreciate your comments.
Representative Lohmer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my question is there some reason we're not able to shut down some of these places like the last place on earth with what you just said?
Mr. Chair, Representative, this problem is relatively unique because we have the law enforcement component of it, which is the local police department, sheriff's department, or our agents that are involved in it. You have prosecutors, and we also have some very reluctant or resistant businesses to comply. And so in many cases with other substances, we're able to take civil action. And so I know there's some prosecutors on the agenda today. That may be a better question for them. We can continue to take law enforcement action, but when you start bringing case after case after case, there's a sense of redundancy, and of course all of those efforts add costs to the prosecution, law enforcement, and so forth, and it takes a while to get through the criminal justice process. So I think maybe some of the county attorneys may be able to better address that this afternoon.
Representative Ward?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Senator, during our legislative session, Representative Savick talked at length in our Public Safety Committee, talked about public education making an impact in states that she participated in. I don't remember what state the legislators on the Public Safety could maybe help me with that, but she was pretty emphatic about trying to do some pilot programs in the state of Minnesota regarding public education and synthetics, and I'm trying to make an impact with our children, especially. Mr. Senator, and you mentioned that. I'm glad that you mentioned that, and that we have made an impact on meth in the state of Minnesota, both with enforcement and education as well. And we can all kind of visualize some of those commercials we've seen regarding that and made an impact, perhaps hopefully with our youth in particular, but with all citizens. So my question to you, Mr. Senator, is what type of public education would you suggest as we look to try to make an impact on synthetics? What type would you suggest? Like meth, the meth education, public education, or what types? Where would you go? That kind of thing.
Superintendent?
Mr. Chair, Representative Ward, I'm certainly not an education expert or public education expert, and I would defer to some of our previous experience, methamphetamine being one of the most recent ones. Some of the issues we're having with opiates and heroin, in particular, as it continues to grow, you're starting to see greater discussions because of the public health risk. And I think it's important not to just focus our efforts on the law enforcement part of this. I do think we have to partner with the Department of Health, Human Services, and so forth, and we all have to be at the same table and try to figure out what those strategies are. And again, I'm not trying to be evasive, but I would defer to the educational experts in terms of strategy, but I would envision something similar to the methamphetamine initiatives we've seen around the country over the last 10 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see no further questions, so thank you, Superintendent, and thank you as well, Stevens, for your testimony. Appreciate it. Members, we said we'd take a break for lunch. Is everybody okay if we come back at, say, 1 o'clock or maybe just shortly thereafter? We'll try to get this wrapped up. Does that work? Okay, let's do that. Let's take a break for lunch. We'll be back about 1:05.